You got a problem with the Woody Woodpecker?
Yeah, what is he, some sort of an instigator?
That's right. He's a troublemaker.
The best cartoon characters have always been the troublemakers. It's hard to find someone whose favorite is Mickey Mouse, but it's easy to find fans of Bugs Bunny. In particular, I've always had a fondness for little bastards, the Bart Simpsons and Dennis's the Menaces, a character archetype that I feel has sadly gone out of favor in recent years. Millennials had their pick of mischievous little brats to emulate. The 90s and early 2000s were a golden age of rambunctious little snots from Beavis and Butthead to Eric Cartman. But if you were part of the generation raised on psychotic YouTube kids videos while your mom complained on Facebook about how hard it is to take care of you, who do you really have to look up to? You got Louise Belcher, but she rates on the lower end of the mischief spectrum. Her misdeeds are rarely criminal and usually well-intentioned. And if parents have ever rallied against the character as a bad influence, it's not happened at nearly the level of cultural permeation as it did with every second cartoon released in the 1990s.
This one has been expelled from some schools for its profanity. Another, underachiever and proud of it, has been kicked out of classes from Orange, California to Fremont, Ohio.
You're an underachiever, you shouldn't be proud of it.
I imagine you could trace the roots of the shit ass all the way back to caveman times, but the little monster as we know him today, I believe, really begins with Max and Moritz. Max and Moritz are the rascals from the German book, A Story of Seven Boyish Pranks, written and illustrated by Wilhelm Busch. Like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, this was an episodic series of mischievous misadventures. Unlike Tom Sawyer, Max and Moritz are just nasty little f***ers. Tom Sawyer could be crass and inconsiderate, but Max and Moritz start with animal cruelty and work their way up to attempted murder. This is why all due respect to Mark Twain, but I believe that the Menace as we know him today really took form with the injection of sociopathic disregard you can only get from the Germans. The first prank is pulled on a local widow when the boys tie a bunch of her chickens together, killing them. In the second, they wait until the widow cooks the chickens before swiping them with a fishing pole down the chimney. She blames the dog and beats him for it. Next, they go to the tailor's house and saw his bridge apart. They lure him out by making goat noises and he's swept away, nearly drowning, only to be saved by a pair of geese. From there it's on to the teacher, filling his pipe with gunpowder. Then they pack their uncle's bed with bugs, after which they sneak into the baker's shop to steal some pretzels, before falling into a vat of dough and being baked into bread, chewing through the crust to escape. Finally, Max and Moritz prank a farmer by cutting his grain sacks, and the farmer responds by grinding them at the mill and feeding them to the ducks, whereupon, quote, no one expresses regret. Max and Moritz were inspired at least in part by the folkloric prankster Till Eulenspiegel, believed to have possibly been a real historical figure, an original prankster, as it were. The bridge prank and the chicken prank in particular are pretty much the same in Max and Moritz as they are in the stories of Till Eulenspiegel. I'm not going to focus on Eulenspiegel too much because that was a real dude and I'm specifically interested in cartoon characters here. And it was in Max and Moritz that this archetype took shape in misbehaving juveniles. And because I'm tired of saying Eulenspiegel. But all the same, it's worth noting that you can trace all these little shits back to a real-life scoundrel. Prior to the publication of Max and Moritz, Wilhelm Busch had been making a living writing for satirical magazines Münchener Bildenborger, a couple of German satirical magazines, sort of the Mad Magazine and National Lampoon of 1860s Germany. Busch's work was frequently critical of religious authoritarianism, and this was in 19th century Germany, a time and place where the counterculture wasn't just a CIA psyop. When Busch offered his publisher, Caspar Braun, rights to Max and Moritz, Braun was eager to take the deal, paying Busch 1,000 gulden, or twice a craftsman's annual wages in those days. Sales started slow, but by Busch's death in 1908, the book had moved about 500,000 copies over 56 editions. And more importantly, Busch had German parents and school teachers lamenting the bad influence his characters were having on the youth of a nation, the true mark of success in this category of storytelling. Max and Moritz served as inspiration for any number of mischief makers, but perhaps none more iconic than the Katzenjammer Kids. Cartoonist Rudolf Dirks had been born in Germany in 1877, but spent most of his life in the United States, having moved to Chicago at 7 years old. While working for William Randolph Hearst's New World Journal, Dirks was asked by editor Rudolf Bloch to come up with a script based on Max and Moritz. Dirks sketched a few bratty little kids, and Bloch came up with the name Katzenjammer, which translates to cat's whale or caterwaul. The strip debuted in 1897. To put that into perspective, this would essentially make it the Family Guy to Max and Moritz's Flintstones. That Katzenjammer Kids found a gap in the market had more to do with distance of geography than of time. Max and Moritz weren't much older in the 1890s than the Simpsons are now. The Katzenjammer Kids were one of the cornerstone strips of that bygone age where newspaper comics were printed like 5-10 times the size they are now, so the layouts look really dense to modernize, but remember, this was a full page back in the 1900s. It wasn't being squished down to the size of a dollar bill. This would dwarf even a 2-page comic book splash panel today. The Katzenjammer Kids were Hans and Fritz, a pair of rebellious twins being raised by their mama and surrogate father, Der Captain. The Katzenjammer Kids featured serialized adventure stories, with the real meat of the comic being the various pranks that the kids would play on the adults. A typical joke might see them snipping the captain's hammock in his sleep or shooting fireworks up the mast, and punishment came in the form of a swift spanking, or, when the captain was feeling creative, being set to sleep on the water. As funny as it may be to bake little boys into bread or grind them into duck food, the Katzenjammer Kids were a money printing machine, so nobody was in that much of a hurry to kill them off. If you're not 100 years old, it's hard to imagine how big a deal newspaper comics were in the first half of the 20th century. These days you get a Garfield movie or a Boondocks TV show now and then, but case in point, how many of you didn't even know the Boondocks was a comic strip until I said it just now? In the pre-war era, comic strips were an integral piece of American pop culture, with the Katzenjammer Kids alone producing 2 live-action silent features and an animated series fairly early into the strip's run. Comic strips syndicated by William Randolph Hearst were estimated to reach around 10 million households every day by 1913. Assuming an average of just 2 readers per household, this puts the Katzenjammer Kids on par with The Simpsons in its prime, reaching around 20 million viewers a week for seasons 5 and 6. The Katzenjammer Kids was so popular that it actually split into 2 competing strips. When Rudolf Dirks was denied a sabbatical after 15 years of working on the strip, he was replaced by Harold Knurr in 1914, while Dirks went on to launch The Captain and the Kids. Basically the exact same comic strip in every single way, except that it ran in the journal's rival paper, the Pulitzer. The 2 strips were pretty much neck and neck in popularity throughout their runs. The Katzenjammer Kids was still running new strips in 2006, and it's still in syndication today, running reprints, making it the longest running comic strip of all time. World War II. If you're wondering how a German-themed comic strip remained so popular throughout World Wars I and II, the answer is they renamed it to the Shenanigan Kids, and they presented the boys as being Dutch rather than German. Meanwhile, over in Germany, cartoonist O.E. Plauen was banned from working in comics by the Third Reich after drawing a drunk pissing a swastika in the snow. Eventually, he was able to draw the comic strip Father and Son under the pseudonym Erich Oser. The strip was apolitical, but Plauen continued to make fun of Goebbels and Himmler in private, leading to an arrest and suicide on the morning of his trial. Pop culture in post-war Germany veered strongly away from politics for obvious reasons, but after so much banning, burning, and censorship, German artists jumping ship to America, the country was effectively recovering from a cultural mass suicide. But that's above my pay grade. Actually, I'm not even partnered yet, so everything is. Anyway, Dennis and the Menace. I think it can be argued that the pre- and post-war history of the genre bottlenecks around Dennis the Menace, which launched in early March of 1951. I mean both versions. They independently launched in the same week of the same year, completely independent of one another. Hank Ketchum based Dennis the Menace off of his own son when Dennis Ketchum didn't want to take a nap and made a mess of his room. Dennis's mother coined the name, calling the boy a menace. This is pretty typical stuff, right? Dennis Ketchum wasn't tying chickens together or packing gunpowder in his dad's pipe. He just didn't feel like taking a nap one day. I've always read the American Dennis the Menace as being less about a problem child than it is about the outsized reaction of adults to kids being kids. Whether that was Hank Ketchum's intention or not, who can say? But I think it's telling that the Dennis the Menace video game was retitled simply Dennis when it was released in the UK. Because the title actually means something over there. You can't go self-applying it willy-nilly. If the American Dennis the Menace was an influence on later Rascals, it was by counterexample. Matt Groening described Dennis as a namby-pamby disappointment.
The show started out with this animated opening sequence with this tornado, this human tornado coming and spinning in. And then the name of the show was Dennis the Menace. There was a kid on TV who was a menace. I was so thrilled by the idea of any kid who was actually bad and naughty. And then it turned out to be this namby-pamby thing. I think the kid had a slingshot. I don't think he ever used it.
The American Dennis the Menace was not a rebel or a revolutionary. He was positioned as a disruptor of the status quo, but seeding only the most harmless misbehavior. The UK Dennis the Menace was a right bastard. He actually used his slingshot. The kid was the goddamn reckoning you fuckers had coming to you. The UK Dennis was developed by Scottish cartoonist David Law, sketching on a cigarette pack in a St. Andrew's pub while meeting with editor Ian Chisholm. Law would go on to draw the character for British anthology comic The Beano until 1970 when he fell ill, leading to his passing in 1971. Under Law's pen, Dennis and his dog Gnasher's Mischief would see them starting fights at a dog show, disrupting the democratic process, using a boomerang to knock the hats off of policemen, and trashing a music class, using a violin as a bow and arrow and a harp as a trampoline. Dennis would frequently end up taking the business end of a slipper or a paddle, but it would be dishonest to describe these comics as cautionary tales. The appeal was clearly indulging in Dennis's random acts of destruction. Dennis the Menace has gone through a number of reboots and artists over the years, with the most disappointing being the 2009 relaunch, which saw a less menacing Dennis phasing out the use of his slingshot and pea shooter. They even dropped the word menace from the title in this era. A 2012 relaunch helmed by artist Nigel Parkinson and writer Nigel Ochterlooney brought the character back to his roots. Sort of like Coke bringing back Coca-Cola Classic after the failure of New Coke.
Inside this can is the new taste of Coca-Cola. The best tasting Coca-Cola ever. You will taste the new taste immediately, and you will like it a lot.
Where have all the bastards gone? If you're talking about an archetype, there's really no way to deliver a comprehensive history. Every culture in the world has their own rascal, ranging in naughtiness from Shin-Chan to Lil Slugger. This is the little bastard with 1,000 faces. So what's my thesis here? Well, I think the presence and presentation of mischievous characters says a lot about the surrounding culture. I think their relative absence in recent years is worrying. I think it's worrying that Bart Simpson, who used to openly ridicule parent company 21st Century Fox, now bends the knee to Disney. Seeing him parade around in mouse regalia after declaring them an evil corporation in the Simpsons movie,
I am the mascot of an evil corporation,
feels a bit like a hazing ritual. I think the degree to which we tolerate kids being kids says a lot about us. Millennials will talk a big game about free-range parenting and so on, but over the last 20 years, the number of children being prescribed ADHD meds in the United States has doubled, with 1 in 20 now taking pills. I'm not qualified to say whether or not a kid needs to be medicated, and I don't mean to condemn ADHD medication in general, but medication errors, including misdiagnoses and double dosing, have tripled.
A shortage of ADHD medication is leaving some parents in limbo, and they're wondering if they're going to have enough pills to help their children.
Yeah, experts say shortages of medications are not rare, but the shortage of ADHD medications is in a category of its own.
I don't think you get Elsagate from a generation of parents who tolerate moderate mischief and misbehavior. That's a direct result of parking your kid in front of a tablet for 16 hours a day, leaving YouTube Kids content creators not knowing how else to connect their meager supply to unprecedented demand. I don't think parents who like spending time with their kids invent trunk or treat, where you do a lap around the parking lot and get Halloween over and done with in 15 minutes. Hell, did you even get any trick-or-treaters last Halloween? I didn't. I don't think we've seen in my lifetime a generation of moms and dads with a lower tolerance for the sound of children's laughter. And the relative absence of mischievous little bastards in American pop culture right now, I think is the calm before the storm, and that we're about to reap what we've sown. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.